Hello. It's the end of a long working day, particularly long post-holiday working day. But I just wanted to share some thoughts about some of the things that have happened today. One of the things that I like about Instagram is that it tends to be an oasis away from some of the more, shall we say, intense political content that you find on other social media platforms. And so it's always been my intention not to comment about politics here. I've posted, pictures of our pets and our children and the meals we have and our vacations and so forth. And I've always sort of scrupulously avoided anything that would be political or controversial, but it really doesn't seem right to let today pass, especially, as a lawyer, without commenting about some of the things that happened in Washington, D.C. today. I'm an old guy. I voted in my first presidential election 40 years ago in 1980. I've been following politics and presidential politics since as far back as I can recall, and certainly as far back as 1968. So I've been observing these things for a very long time. And, I have to say that I have never seen anything quite like what transpired today in Washington, D.C. And to say that it was disturbing and to say that it was depressing is only, the tip of the iceberg. But I can't say, in all fairness, that I was surprised by the events that occurred today, because since before the election, there has been, from certain quarters, an almost daily assault on our Constitution, on democracy itself, and on the rule of law. And so we should not be surprised that that brought us to today. We've watched over the past couple of months, I guess 3 months now, 2 months, we've watched, a constant effort to undermine what can only be fairly described as a free and fair election. A constant effort to cast doubt on legally cast ballots, on certified results, and on the democratic process itself. We've seen countless legally frivolous arguments advanced by the president, by his legal team, by members of Congress, by politicians and elected officials all over the country in service of a president who does not seem to have the slightest respect for the law, for our traditions, for our Constitution, for our institutions, and so forth. And so we should not be surprised by what transpired today. As a lawyer, I can tell you that while you cannot make legally frivolous arguments in court, you are free to make legally frivolous arguments outside of court. You can advance all the legally frivolous arguments you want in the context of a legitimate protest in the street. But what you can't do is crash the government's buildings. You can't break down barriers and charge into the halls of Congress and attempt to intimidate and threaten members of Congress who are carrying out their constitutional duty to count the votes in the Electoral College so that we can move on from this nightmare. That's unacceptable. And that's not simply random acts of violent thugs. These are acts that were encouraged by the President of the United States. These are acts that were encouraged by members of Congress, even those who said, we're only asking questions. They knew they were stoking this anger and animosity. And the people who participated in these protests, which were in fact riots, today are people who have told us for weeks that this was what they were going to do. So no one should have been surprised by what transpired today, but everyone should be outraged by it. And on top of all of that, on top of this nonstop assault on the rule of law and our democratic institutions, Imagine the indignity that we visited today on Black Americans who sat through and watched the protests that erupted this summer in response to the completely unjustified killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many more Black Americans who died at the hands of the police without the remotest justification. We watched those protests, Black Americans watched those protests, and they saw a heavy-handed police response. They saw police in riot gear. They saw the National Guard called out. They saw unnamed, unidentified federal agents scooping people up off the streets. They saw police in many instances engaging in unjustified acts of violence against peaceful protesters, right? So they watched all this transpire. And then today, what did they see? Today, what they saw was a compliant police department, a police department that fell back, a police department that allowed these, not protesters, rioters to swarm the halls of Congress. And in some instances, police officers stopped and posed for pictures with these individuals, took selfies with these folks. And at the end of the day, just let them walk away free. Imagine what it's like to be a Black American who's witnessed the things that Black Americans have witnessed, who saw protests, justifiable, understandable protests, met with a heavy-handed and sometimes violent police response, and then they turn around and watch what happened today in the name of destroying our democracy. I don't want to be political on Instagram. I don't want to be political in any situation if I don't have to be. But this isn't about politics. This is about right and wrong and about saving our country and standing up for the rule of law. There have to be consequences for what happened today. I don't mean protesters or rioters should be arrested. That's, the police have to decide how to deal with that situation. But I do believe that our political leaders who encouraged this and stoked these fears and this anger and fed lies to people to get them to think this was an appropriate response, I think those political leaders need to face some consequences. I know a number of governors have called on the president to be impeached, called on Congress to impeach and remove the president. I know, and that includes at least one Republican governor. I know that there are stories circulating tonight that members of the cabinet are discussing whether or not they should invoke the 25th Amendment and seek to remove the president. Obviously, people have called on him to resign. I'll leave it to other people to decide what the consequence should be for the president. But there have to be some consequences, or we have ceded this territory to people who would just destroy the rule of law. So I'm sorry for the political commentary. I certainly don't intend to come back to this unless it's necessary, but something has to be done. So thanks for your time. Good night.